Hello and welcome to this Finextra webinar on Anubis malware and what to do about it. I'm Jane Cooper, your moderator for today. I'm not Anna Milne. She was scheduled to do this session, but there's been a change of plans, so I'm afraid you've got me instead. I hope that's okay. So mobile banking has just become so easy. The user experience is amazing. I use my mobile for everything, for all my banking, and I just have so many apps. I just go to the Google Play Store, download all sorts of things, click away, and it's done. And I've got all my money there and I can do all my payments. It's great. But unfortunately, cyber criminals have also cottoned onto this, and they are increasingly targeting mobile banking apps. And now I'm beginning to wonder, maybe all those things I've been downloading, perhaps they aren't what I thought they were. Perhaps there's something quite nasty in there. And today we'll be talking about a particularly pernicious kind of threat, and that's the Anubis malware. So we've got a great lineup of speakers, and we'll be discussing what this malware is, what we can do about it, what the industry response has been, and we'll also take a look of the future and where all this is going. So I'd like to thank those speakers for joining us. They're all there, logged in and ready to go. I'll introduce them in a second. And I'd also like to thank OneSpan, who have made this webinar possible. In your viewing console, you should be able to see a white paper that OneSpan have made available, and that's on runtime application self-protection. So you can download that and read it later. Don't read it now. Please watch this now and read that later. Some bedtime reading for you. And also in your viewing panel, there's a question box. So we want this to be as interactive as possible, and we want the audience watching this to send in the questions. So please get thinking about your questions now and keep those questions simple and brief. Get them in early. I won't be identifying who is asking the questions, so this means you can be a little bit provocative if you like, but please be nice. So there's no separate Q&A section at the end of this webinar. The questions will be fed and filtered into the main discussion. So the earlier you send in the question, the better, the more likely it is that we'll get to it. So a quick reminder of the format. So the speakers will each take their turn in the opening remarks. They have about 2 minutes each to give their opening statements. We'll go into the main discussion, and that will include the questions from the audience. We have a couple of poll questions, so we want you to click on those answers as well. Please get involved. And then we'll wrap up towards the end, and we'll finish on the hour. Okay, so without further ado, let's do the introductions. So we have a data strategy guy. So this is Greg Hansel. He's the Director of Product Management Data Strategy at OneSpan. Greg, give us a wave. Give us a wave. Hello, there he is. Yep.
Hello.
Hey, Greg, good to see you. And next up, we have James Coveney, who's Head of Data Science at Cash Plus. And James, do you want to give us a wave? Yep, there he is. Good to see you. And last but not least, we have a doctor in the house, Dr. Hossam Abu El Dahab, Digital Demand Office Head at Alex Bank. Brilliant. So good to see you all, and thank you so much for making the time to do this. Right. Okay, so let's get to it. Who wants to kick off? James, are you feeling brave? Do you want to start us off with the opening comments? What do you want to say? What are your views on this topic? I'll hand over to you.
Cheers. So, hi everyone. I'm James Coveney. I'm Head of Data Science at Cash Plus Bank. So I look after data science and fraud and financial crime analytics, and I've been in the analytics data science space for about 12 years. I think this is a really interesting topic. In particular, I think it's something that's going to be more important as time goes on, particularly with third-party providers providing banking software, and a number of digital banks doing almost all of their interaction with customers via apps. So it's something that's going to be increasingly important over the years to come, and an area that I think will be targeted in particular by bad actors in the space. Okay,
brilliant. Hossam, how about you? What are your sort of opening thoughts or comments on this broad topic?
Uh, Actually, I would like to start with some interesting numbers to understand how the world is seems digitally. As per the last report from Hootsuite in Jan 2022, the people reached worldwide 7.9 billion people, and 5.3 billion of this number has a mobile phone user, unique mobile phone user, and also 4.9 billion of these users have access to the internet through the mobile application, which means that the mobile application is one of the most common channels to people to interact with the internet itself. And also the mobile banking apps download generated $693 billion by 2021. And the fintech global market is expected to reach over 324 billion by 2026. This number is significantly explain how the world is moving towards the digital banking and the digital devices. While the bad news, actually in 2022, the fraud cases has been increased by 50%, and the cyber fraud reached $6 trillion by 2021. 89% of this fraud was due to the account takeover, which means the frauder was successful to reach the account sensitive data, and most of them were using the physical devices of the victim. So from this number, actually, I can imagine that the customer becomes the weakness link in this value chain in the digital financial services. That's why all banks and financial institutions are giving high attention to the customer while they are fighting with the fraudsters themselves.
Brilliant, thank you. So it's becoming a bigger problem. Those numbers are
Yeah.
quite massive. Okay, Greg, what are your opening thoughts?
Sure. Thanks, Jane, and a pleasure to be here today. Hello, everyone. Yeah, so it's similar to James and Hassan, we're seeing a mass adoption of digital banking and specifically going to mobile. So it's more important than ever that you do secure that mobile experience. And also, what I'd say is that we can't necessarily rely on a general public to know of the advanced attacks that are occurring. It's up to us to educate, of course, but it's also up to the industry itself to provide the answers to these kinds of attacks. And where would I open it up slightly on that? I'd say, well, we've seen a huge amount of data breaches. So it's 2020, we had a record year. 2021, the second highest record year, and 2019, the third highest record year. So all in, there've been around roughly 79 billion records breached in 3 years. So I roughly calculate around 20% of the global population is available now on the dark web. So we not only need to think about how do we secure the application and stop the attack, we also need to consider how can we secure against process abuse. And that goes for onboarding, provisioning, as well as login and account takeover as well.
Okay, brilliant. So before we sort of get into the discussion, maybe, Greg, can you just describe to us what is Anubis malware? Can you just sort of explain to us like how scary it is? or what it is,
gladly.
basically. What is it? Maybe let's not scare people. Just tell us what it is.
Sure. Yes, so Anubis has been around for quite some time, in fact. I think it was first became aware of it in 2016, and more recently, 2019, 2020, added a command and control capability to that with a proxy, so it can communicate with a server. In essence, it's a banking Trojan malware that's targeting financial institutions, cryptocurrency wallets, and virtual payments platforms. In 2020, in the summer, it masqueraded as an official app from a telecoms provider for Orange in France. And its goal is to collect data about the victim from their mobile device for financial gain. It's there to essentially steal credentials and to interject in a login process. And some of the things that it can do, so it can record screen activity and sound from the microphone. It can communicate with its server in a secure way. It can capture screenshots, send mass SMS messages from the device. So it can actually act as a smishing botnet, let's say, retrieve contacts stored on the device, send, receive, deleting, blocking of notifications, SMSs, scan the device for files to exfiltrate. It can lock the device screen, add a persistent ransomware node. It can capture the device information, implement a keylogger to steal credentials, monitor active apps and perform overlay attacks. And where does it, I guess, become a problem? Well, when malware has that control over your device, your device is not in the hands of your customer, your user. More, it's in the hands of the attacker. So how does that create a bigger problem to financial institutions? Well, the code itself was leaked, and so you can essentially see that as being available to all on the dark web for Anubis. And as I've just described, it's quite a complete and advanced attack. So it can bypass two-factor authentication, registration, activation processes for many applications. It can actively intercept a one-time password and then replay that, or it can present an overlay to a user in a dynamic fashion so they don't know that they're interacting with a malicious application whilst they provide their data. Last year, we saw 400 financial institutions targeted in a couple of days. And that's the real scary part of it, is that it's the capability to automate those kinds of attacks on scale in an advanced way.
Yeah, that is scary. So when I'm downloading stuff from Google Play, I might actually be downloading a fake app. It kind of looks the same, and then something pops up and I go, yeah, that's fine, and I'm actually overriding the security stuff, and then it just sort of takes all my information. I'm doing my banking. I think it's my bank, but it's not. That's quite, it's sophisticated. I mean, it's amazing. It's very clever and very sophisticated, but also very scary. And those numbers, like 400 financial institutions, wow. So James, is this something that's on your radar? I mean, what would you, I guess you don't want to talk too specifically about your own institution, but would you say in the industry and other institutions, there is an awareness of this or not?
There certainly should be. Yeah, I think across financial services, the answer would be yes, because typically there's a lot of investment in cybersecurity and fraud in financial services. I think the problem perhaps is the kind of wider internet in a sense, or that it doesn't have to be an attack on a financial services institution for customers of those institutions to be compromised. So, one of the things that is a big risk across the industry is people reusing passwords, reusing logon details, their device being compromised through some other means completely unrelated to a banking app, and then that information being used in order to compromise the accounts of a customer with a bank. So I think, given the scope of the App Store and the number of different types of companies that can deploy apps, does create a risk with these kinds of attacks with smaller companies who perhaps can't invest in the kind of resource and the infrastructure that banks can. So for me, I would say personally that's the key risk, and obviously within banks, of course, that there is always going to be a risk as well. But from my point of view, it's actually non-financial institutions that perhaps pose a bigger risk in a sense.
Yeah. Hossam, what about you? What are you seeing? Is that similar to what you're seeing?
Yes, I think it is the same, but sometimes it is different due to regulations or the state of fintech awareness from the one category to another one. So in general, it is the same, but with some differences based on the situation and the maturity of the customer itself.
Yeah, great. Okay, so I did have a follow-up question. I think, was it Greg? I can't remember. You mentioned about the sort of customer education. Maybe we can educate customers. Is there a risk that if you make customers aware of this threat, that you actually sort of scare them? There's a balance, isn't there? You want them to know that you're on this and everything is secure, but you don't want to make them too aware, because then you just sort of scare them and they might not want to use it altogether. Is that an issue that's a concern about educating customers? Maybe Greg can answer that first.
Back to the main thread, actually, I think the main thread it was account takeover, which is attacking the customer due to the weakness or the poor knowledge of how to secure the sensitive data during the online transacting and so on. So I think educating the customer is one of the main strategies actually applied in the region, and especially in Egypt as well, because the last incident it was due to the lack of knowledge the customers that they provided sensitive data to the fraudsters. So educating the customer will prevent the highest portion of fraud inside the region. I'm not speaking only in Egypt, while if I'm speaking in Egypt specifically, I believe that the Central Bank of Egypt is doing a great job in this, and even they are sponsoring clips to spread the knowledge and the understanding of how the customer should deal with the fraudsters and how they can manage the suspicious calls and the suspicious emails coming through the malware and so on. So they are encouraging the customer to just whenever they suspicious any call or any communication through any third party to just break it. And even I recall that one of the fantastic clips, it's very common here in Egypt, which is chock, sock, clock. These are two words in Arabic, and the last one, which is block. But the meaning is once you are find a suspicious call from anyone you don't know and asking you about a sensitive data, you have to close the call and make a block, and even you can call a hotline to tell the agency that there is a suspicious call asking for a sensitive data, and accordingly take the proper action against this.
What's it called? Chop, sock, block? What was it? Sorry. Chop.
Shock.
Shock.
Sock. Block. Chock. It means that this is a suspicious call, and sock it means close the call immediately, and the block it is an English word, by the way, which is block this number to not receiving any calls again from him.
That sounds like a good campaign. Greg, do you have any sort of follow-up comment to that? Do you think we should be doing more of that, or does this kind of scare customers? Do you have any view?
I think what Hassan mentioned is great. So to educate the general public and to get them to act as your extended firewall, let's say a human firewall. What I would say is I would somewhat use a story to make a comparison in that a general public should have a knowledge on how to prevent risks. And if I liken that to, let's say, an escape of water in a house, right? So if you are going away for a period of time or in a caravan, then you would turn your water off because it may freeze and therefore escape from a pipe. So that's something that you can do as the owner of your property. However, you wouldn't necessarily try and fit the boiler yourself, or service the boiler itself. So what I would say is that it's up to the FIs to do that kind of hard stuff, and it's up to the general public to get an understanding around how can they reduce their risks that they're exposed to on their devices and their interactions. From a knowledge of, I guess, risk, what I would say is that there's perhaps a misconception that hardware is more secure than software. So if we say hardware for the authenticator and software meaning the mobile device, well, it can and it cannot be, in that a hardware device is air-gapped, so there's potentially no chance of getting malware onto that device. So the creation of the one-time password is secure. However, that one-time password needs to be input somewhere. So if the user is being dynamically phished, and they are interacting with a phish page, then the entry of that one-time password is actually onto the attacker's website. So if you then liken that to software, where you're potentially making use of a mobile device that has secure communication and is a trusted device, and a trusted communication between the user's device and the bank itself, then you can secure that, and you can argue, given the context that you can derive from that device, that you have a higher understanding of what the user is doing and the risks that are present.
Okay, so we'll go to a poll question in a second. Before we do that, James, do you have anything you want to add, or any thoughts you want to follow up with on what Hossam and Greg have just said? No worries if not.
Yeah, no, I just concur really with the concept of communicating with customers, and I also agree that I think whilst that's very important, there's always going to be a large part of it which is just beyond the sort of knowledge of the average person. And you know, much as it's important to try and encourage customers and people to do sensible things and act in a sort of a way which is conscious of these kinds of risks, we also can't realistically expect everyone to use password managers, everyone to use a different password for every site. I think certain types of behaviours we just have to accept exist and sort of work around that with our controls and our approach to mitigating these kinds of risks within financial institutions.
Okay, brilliant. So we've got some audience questions coming in, so I'll get to those in a second. Before we do that, let's go to the poll question. So everybody watching this, please click away, and I'd like our speakers to I'll ask you in a second what you think the answers might be. Okay, so let me read out the question. How likely do you think it will be that you are attacked with an advanced mobile malware attack like Anubis? Highly likely, just a matter of time. Likely, it might happen this year or next. Or unlikely, not in the next 5 years. Okay, how likely do you think it will be that you are attacked with an advanced mobile malware attack like Anubis? Highly likely, just a matter of time. Likely, or unlikely? Okay, so we'll give the audience a bit of a chance to respond to that, and we'll revisit that in a few moments. Okay, so let's go with some of the questions from the audience. Maybe let's go. Okay, there's quite a few here. Okay, James, maybe I'll try with you. So you have a first stab at answering it, and then I'll go to Hossam if you want to sort of throw the ball to him. Okay, here's the question. Are there any customer-friendly ways to remove advanced malware from devices? What do you have an answer to that?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one, because obviously if a customer has had their device compromised, they're naturally going to be on high alert, and so those conversations can be very difficult with customers in terms of ensuring them, you know, and reassuring them that you are who you say you are. But I think the removal of malware from devices is something that the customer really has to do themselves. It can't be sort of, as far as I'm aware anyway, it's not necessarily my area of expertise, this bit, but done remotely, you know, from a financial institution. So yeah, I think overall, yeah, I like I said, not my specific area of expertise. I'll defer to the other guys on this one a little bit, but I do think that one of the most important things with this kind of situation is ensuring that when you're speaking to a customer in this situation, that you're able to reassure them that they're dealing with the genuine entity, however that may be, through sort of whether it be something along the lines of sorry, you know what? I'm just going to hand over because not my other expertise, so I'm going to pass over to Greg or Hossam.
That's okay, that's fine. So Greg or Hossam, do you want to pick up on that, or we can move to the next question? Are there any customer-friendly ways to remove advanced malware from devices? Maybe Greg, do you want to have a stab at answering that?
Yes, I have two comments here. The first one, which is there is a lot of tools actually. The customer or the user can download it from the official app stores, either Google or Apple, what is they use the mobile. Even searching by removing malware, they will find a lot of applications, free applications as well, for the basic features that they can download and use it. This is the first comment, while from the people taking the hat of prevention, which means I shouldn't, as a customer, I shouldn't deal with any unknown source of communications without clicking any links shared with me in a social media, shared with me through an email or something like this, because all of such phishing or malware software comes from, most of them actually, it comes from the interactions between the user and the other side, which is the fraudster. So I would like to shed light on the importance of the preventive actions, which is you shouldn't interact with any unknown source of communications as long as you don't know the person communicating with you. You shouldn't interact with any shared media from his side.
Okay, Greg, do you have anything else you want to add before I go to the next question?
I think that was well answered. To be honest, it's more a case of prevention in that sense. You can of course shield the app as well, and there are antivirus applications available, though. Of course, that doesn't necessarily stop a 0-day or an end day or something of that nature. Yeah, so I agree with Hassan's remarks on that.
Okay, brilliant. So I wanted to discuss about the industry response to all of this. So James, I want to ask you, I guess we're in a bit of a sort of arms race as mobile banking is getting better, the cyber criminals are getting better as well. And you can't always predict where it's going to go or how good the cyber criminals are going to get, but you've got to be prepared, right, to combat. So how do you sort of approach that problem with sort of planning for the future, even though you don't quite know what it's going to look like?
Yeah, I think the best approach to these kinds of things, in my view, is always a combination of data science and analytics, domain knowledge, so people with specific knowledge in the area, and kind of more logical rule-based approaches as well. I don't think there's any sort of specific golden ticket out there that like stops these kind of things. In particular, like you mentioned, this is an area that's changing very, very quickly. Fraud and all types of sort of cybercrime are constantly adapting. So the nature of most data science algorithms and machine learning in general requires some kind of past knowledge that you use to infer into the future. So if the past isn't reflective of the future, if the future is significantly different from what happened in the past, then a lot of traditional machine learning techniques don't necessarily work that well. So whilst those techniques are very important and they can be adapted to fit this kind of problem, it does need to be combined, in my opinion, with rules and fast-paced reactions to emerging problems, and that can only really be done. You have people within the organisation who are sort of experts within the field and are on top of what's happening in the wider sort of ecosystem. You know, both from an internal perspective and what's going on out there on the dark web and so on. So I think yeah, it's very important that there's a kind of combined approach to it rather than necessarily thinking there's some perfect solution.
Okay, brilliant. So I also have a question I'd like to ask about the vulnerabilities. So Hossam, I'm guessing you don't want to talk about where the vulnerabilities are in your mobile banking app. I don't know if cyber criminals are watching this webinar, but maybe don't go into the details of your bank. Maybe can you talk more generally? So where do you think the biggest vulnerabilities are in mobile banking apps?
Actually, I have a lot of stories because I'm working here in Egypt while I worked with 20 countries in Africa, and I have a lot of vulnerabilities stories. But in general, I think the main vulnerability is, as we mentioned, the account takeover, which came through the phishing and malware, and also the physical stealing of the devices itself, because sometimes the fraudster steal the physical device of the victim itself, or even steal the hardware token and using it to accomplish a full transaction within high volumes. In most of Africa countries, they are using the token to authenticate the high volume transactions. More than that, also, I think the authentication is one of the problems should be tackled while we are speaking about the authentication, because a lot of mobile banking apps are using a very basic authentication methods such as username and password, and doesn't work anymore, especially considering all the speech and discussions we are discussed today, because there are three main areas or methods to authenticate the transaction or even the onboarding. Either something I know, which is the username and password, something I have, which like the OTP, the activation code, and so on. And the best one from my point of view, which is something you are, which is using the biometric and the two-factor authentication, especially using the biometric, such as the fingerprint, the voice recognition, the face recognition, anything like this, it will kill the authentication vulnerability. So in brief, again, the main three vulnerabilities I can see is the behavioral one, which is the biggest vulnerability, the behavior from the customer, which enabling the fraudster to have the sensitive data. The second one, which is the phishing through email or something like this, or even through the social media. And the third one is the poor authentication and the unwise usage of the authentication from the customer point of view, like using a very simple password or using the PIN like his birth year or something like this. All of these weaknesses enable the fraudster to easily take over the account of the victim and successfully do the transaction from their side.
Okay, brilliant. So I'll review the poll question in a second. Before I do that, I want to go to Greg and ask you about the key risk indicators. Do you want to sort of comment on what they are and sort of what can be done?
Sure, gladly. So the key risk indicators of malware would be screen overlay, keyboard overlay, rooted jailbroken debugger, connection settings, the payload itself, I guess, that's presented from the device to to the financial institution. And what you're looking for there is a change in the device context, right? So what you need to be able to understand is what was it to what it is now. So what has changed on that? Also, a change in the behavior of the user and the way that they interact with the device. There are technologies out there that allow you to understand the way a user will hold the device, their area under the thumb, the way they interact, the time it takes them to scroll, and so forth, to build up a fingerprint on interaction. And you can also, of course, monitor transfers and beneficiaries and the amount of money that is being transferred, when that is being transferred, when a user logs in, the length of their sessions, these kinds of things as well. So these are the kind of risk indicators that you can identify. Now, why is it perhaps difficult to identify that on that device? Well, there may not be a change, right? So there could be the scenario of Anubis where it's an overlay attack, so you have your genuine user interacting on the device. So it's no different. Perhaps they're a little flustered as they're interacting with a dynamic form, but for all intents and purposes, it's your customer interacting. Also, the payload may have been altered. It may be intercepted and changed. That's then being represented to the bank. So all of the stuff that you have around the device ID, the IP, all this stuff may have been adapted by the attack itself. And the hardest part of this, I guess, is allowing your genuine users to interact with your technology, yet identifying an attacker that's compromised the device, or a user being socially engineered, because it's important that your users can use your products and services. And a good example of that, how that perhaps plays out, is in a keyboard overlay to enable accessibility users to make use of third-party keyboards. What you don't want to do as a financial institution is just say, well, let's exit the application if we see that, because there's a genuine use case for accessibility users to make use of that technology. So you need to be able to secure those users in isolation and identify that it is normal for them to use that, and which types of keyboards are normal for them, and also understand the context around what they are doing as well. And another example could be if you do decide to shield the application, so you can therefore protect against these kinds of attacks, make use of white box cryptography, identify a debugger running and kill the app and so forth. But the challenge you have there is typically you want to kill the application immediately, and then you don't necessarily know about what population of your users are affected because their app has been killed. So you need to consider, well, how do we do this? And also understand how many people does that impact, because we don't want a bad user experience. We want to make sure that it's an appropriate step, let's say. So it's really quite a challenge to not only identify, but also offer still the ideal user experience back to the user.
Yeah, we do have a question about shielding. The poll question is about that. So before we go to the second poll question, let's review the first. James, do you want to sort of comment on what you would have thought the answers would be? So let's have a look at the response. How likely do you think it will be that you are attacked? So there's highly likely, likely, and unlikely. And the most popular response with 47.1% was likely. It might happen this year or next. James, is that something that you would have expected, that kind of response?
Yeah, I would have thought it would be highly likely or likely. I think there are obviously constant attempts on financial institutions and all sorts of companies with apps and sort of, websites, but the efficacy of those is usually very, very low. So I think the likelihood of a successful attack should be relatively low for most mature financial institutions, but the likelihood of intent is very, very high.
Yeah. Okay. So now let's go to the second poll question, which was about shielding. So here's the question. How important is it that the mobile app is shielded? High importance, we shielded the app. Very important, we are looking to shield the app this year. Important, we are looking to shield the app in the next 3 years. Or not important, we won't shield the app in the next 5 years. How important is it that the mobile app is shielded? High importance, very important, important, or not important. Okay, so we'll revisit that poll question in a moment. James, can I ask you about cultural or sort of organizational changes that can be made to make the sort of defense of this malware better? Is there anything that can be done in that area?
Yeah, absolutely. I just firstly, I just touch on a couple of things that Greg and Hossam said a moment ago, and I think one thing, Hossam, you mentioned around devices being physically compromised. I think that's a really important point, because my experience, sometimes there can be an over-reliance on the security of a device. You know, pretty much every financial institution, certainly in the UK, would have a concept of a trusted device. And I think that you need to be careful, the industry needs to be careful not to over-rely on that trusted element. Just because we've seen the device before doesn't mean the device is secure. And secondly, you know, I think what Greg, you were touching on around the difficulty in identifying these kinds of things is that obviously it's easy to stop fraud, to stop financial crime, just refer everything, right? You could significantly reduce your fraud losses if you did that. But you know, the nature of these kinds of things, it's a balance between how do you impact your genuine customers versus how do you identify attacks. And I think that's something that's really difficult in this area, given the incredibly low occurrence of it overall. And as Greg mentioned, that there are lots of genuine reasons for things that look very, very similar to bad events. So yeah, I think that's a really, really key point. And just going back to the question you asked, my view would be that something that's very important is this interaction and collaboration between different departments. So information security, and for example, analytics, data science, and fraud. I think sometimes in my experience, particularly in very large organizations, there's quite a disparate way of approaching these things. You know, so you have an information security approach, and you have an analytical approach, and you have a fraud approach, and they don't really connect with one another. But it's very important, in my view, that the data that is seen from an information security perspective is shared with the data that you see from an analytical data science perspective, and it's also shared with the kind of domain and operational knowledge of the fraud teams, and combining those sort of three elements is, in my opinion, the most powerful way to tackle this. And from a kind of industry perspective, I think sharing of information is very important. I'm a big proponent of that in fraud and information security. I think that the more sharing we do as an industry, the better our defences will be holistically. And there's really, you know, there's lots of ways to share information without it being commercially sensitive. And I think I would encourage that across the industry. I think it's something that's continuing and starting to grow a little bit, but we can do loads more in that area.
Okay, so I have another question for you, James. This is from the audience. Feel free to throw this to Hossam if you don't want to answer it. Are you doing any monitoring of customer mobile devices for the presence of mobile malware? And if so, what actions do you take? Can you answer that? Or maybe Hossam wants to have a go.
Yeah. Of course, we you know, I'm obviously not going into specifics, but yeah, we do monitor devices in various ways in order to sort of ascertain if they're genuine, if there's been any sort of manipulation of the data that we receive and that kind of thing. In terms of actions that we would take, it can range from declining an event. So as Greg mentioned, you know, often, for example, we're talking about a mobile app logon session. You might allow the logon, but then you might refer after some weird behaviour on payment, right? Because if somebody's logging on if there's a bad session, for example, if there's a bad actor involved, typically they're going to want to get money out of the account. So maybe you interject at that point rather than log on, for example. But the action we would take would be relative to the risk, of course, because of that point that Greg raised, and I was just reiterating about not impacting genuine customers. So the action would be variable depending on the sort of risks that we deem at that particular event.
Okay, great. Hossam, I have a question from the audience. If you don't want to ask this, I've got another question for you. So let me try this one on you. How can the average consumer identify if nefarious apps or malware are installed on their phone? Is it easy for customers to know that they've got malware on there?
Yes, I think in general he can notice two things. The first one, or the first action, he can download again one of the applications to check and scan the mobile device itself if there is any malware applications or software installed without he permitted in the application explicitly. And also from the other side, and this is my experience as well, sometimes he can notice a lot of unexpected actions or a lot of pop-ups came to while he is using the mobile applications. So once he can notice that there is a popped up links or redirections from one site to another one, especially to the other side, which is unknown for the customer. At this time, it is a sign that there is something wrong happened in his mobile.
Right. Okay, so I want to review the second poll question in a second. Before I do, Greg, I want to give you the opportunity to sort of follow up on what James and Hossam have just said. Do you have any further comments you'd like to add?
Sure, yes. Touching into what James said, I'm a big advocate on data sharing and of course with privacy. You know, we should not be able to identify or re-identify a user that's been anonymized or a customer that's been anonymized. So what I would say to many financial institutions is we should look to ensure interoperability. So to look to standardize your APIs and the data that's available. Look to consider how do you correlate across those different applications, which is something that James touched into, and also how do you abstract away components that can serve all of your products as, let's say, an enrichment layer to serve all of them rather than being exclusive to one product. And I'd say that we should focus on data quality. That's something I'm sure James is very aware of in his position. It's really key to the performance of a model, and of course getting labeled data for supervised machine learning models. So the quality of that data really, there needs to be considerable focus on that, and that could be in the form of a data dictionary where we look to determine the different data attributes that there are within each of the different applications, and then what the downstream use of that is, i.e. how that is used towards enrichment or how that is used towards modeling. And I would also encourage that we look to anonymize data, however, enrich on edge perhaps, or enrich in premise before looking to anonymize that data, so we don't lose the quality of that data. For example, we don't necessarily need to know the IP address, but it is very useful to know the city or the country, which you can then not re-identify a user from. So that's to ensure that we're getting ourselves into a position of having a useful data set. And James touched into something really important, I thought, on the reuse of data. In the large organizations, they do have many areas of expertise. So an InfoSec team, a security operations center, a SOC, a fraud team, an AML team, payments fraud team, and so forth. But they don't necessarily talk to one another, and neither does their data. And James identified an important point there, and that is the more agile, smaller organizations seemingly are able to connect those together so that the eFraud Security Operations Center has the same kind of intelligence available to it that the Information Security Center does. So you should be benefiting from that. And typically the larger organizations, they have lots of challenges due to where they have come from in terms of, let's say, if you're a larger bank, you have some certain standards for your payments, ISO 8583, some for e-commerce, ISO 20022, open banking, authentication, telephone-based banking branches, all of this data all over the place. And how do you bring all that together? That's quite a challenge, and there's never been a time like now to get started and get involved in that. However, where they are obviously stronger is in terms of decades of regulation and understanding how to secure that data and the user and do the relevant due diligence. And they have an incredible technology shop to develop further from there. For the smaller organizations, that agility can allow them to, from the get-go, design with interoperability and anonymization and privacy in mind, and to make those abstraction with enrichment. So, yeah, I think it's really important that we get started and we start to figure out how do we share that data. And there's some great companies starting to do that. Gaia X, a friend of mine, was involved in the formation of that, and that is around open data sharing. And in doing so, that can really help to, I guess, arm the financial institutions against these kinds of attacks by understanding what is happening in all areas, in all industries, and give them a head start that the attack may be coming their way.
Okay, brilliant. So let's review that second poll question, which was, how important is it that the mobile app is shielded? Whoa, 62.5. So by far, before the answers were a little bit split, but this one we have a clear winner. High importance, we shielded the app. Is that what you'd have expected, James?
Yeah. I'm good.
Yeah.
I think that's expected. Yeah.
I think I would have put my money on that one as well. And Hossam, is that what you were expecting?
Yes, and I'm so happy to see this because I feel that the audience have a good maturity and well alerted about the vulnerability risk itself. So seeing that the app should be or must be shielded, it is actually a good news to see this result.
Okay, brilliant. So we're sort of coming towards the end. The hour is sort of creeping up on us. So let's sort of steer the discussion to the future and the outlook. So maybe, James, do you want to comment on what the future looks like and where this is all going? What do you think is going to happen over the next 12 months or so?
Yeah, I think we're going to see a continuation of attacks, both directly on financial institutions and particularly more broadly across applications and websites that customers interact with. So one thing that we see commonly in the UK, and I'm sure this is true globally, is that attacks are often very much reactive to a current situation. So, for example, at the moment, compromises of COVID-19 apps and websites for the NHS, there's very much an element with the bad actors in this sort of environment reacting and taking advantage of the kind of wider situation in a country. And so that's something that I expect to continue. And I also expect in particular to see attacks on different types of applications, different types of websites in order to collect customers' information or compromise their device, and for then that to then be used downstream to attack a financial institution, because broadly speaking, you would expect the controls of financial institutions to be greater than those of other companies. And just briefly, I think as well, Craig, obviously you're right, data quality is very much at top of my list. And I think one thing that over sort of next sort of short medium term really for all financial institutions should be focusing on the data design phase and the architecture phase of new products or new initiatives to think about how they link the data together, how they ensure that they're capable of identifying the outcomes. Something you see a lot in companies is implementing some new system and then not joining the dots together, right? So maybe they'll put in a new version of the app, but they don't link the application session device to a device in another area of the company. And so you've got multiple device IDs or you've got multiple user IDs. And this kind of thing makes everyone's life a lot more difficult. And so I think there should be a focus on thinking about risk at the design phase of products and the design phase of new sort of database changes and things like that.
Okay, great, thank you. And Greg, do you have predictions for the rest of this year? Have you got your crystal ball there?
Oh golly, I don't necessarily have my own. However, I do read what others put on this, such as Lookout, Kaspersky, some of the others in this space, and I guess from what we see as well. So yeah, I anticipate that malware will continue to rise and continue to become more advanced. You know, the example we gave earlier on of Anubis being available on the dark web to would-be attackers gives them a very powerful toolkit to attack and orchestrate a very advanced attack. Right? I believe we'll continue to see targeted attacks on financial institutions, also in the crypto space, in the wallets and exchanges, and that will continue to accelerate as we see there is a large amount of money and investment into cryptocurrencies. Invoice fraud, APP fraud, as it's called in the UK, or instant transfer fraud, is on the rise, and I believe it will continue to rise as countries enable new ways of instant transfer, and even not only within the country, however, pan country instant transfer. So when we're able to cross continents instantly with these transfers, which is where we're looking to go to in a financial space. I often reflect on that. It's kind of crazy that I can send somebody, you know, a message on WhatsApp and know that they've received it, know that they're typing a message back, yet I can send a payment and have no idea where it's gone. Right? So at some point that will be solved, and there are some very smart people looking to do that. But that also creates an opportunity for attackers to get instant money. So the real-time nature of that means that the technologies need to be able to evaluate that risk in real time to understand it. Perhaps one that's maybe not considered huge, but I'll go with it anyway. I think deep fakes are going to become a problem. I follow a little bit into the gaming side of things, and I've seen the advancement in Unreal Engine and MetaHuman. I also read about the mass data breach of passport photos and data in China. And I would say that China's probably got some of the best facial recognition software in the world, yet they were overcome last year with an advanced attack that was modifying the photographs to fool an algorithm into thinking the person that's interacting with them is that person from that photograph. So I believe that deep fakes or things like this that are part of an onboarding and identity verification perspective will also continue to rise and come to the forefront.
Okay, so we've got to wrap up now. So 30 seconds each. Okay, I've got an imaginary egg timer here. So 30 seconds. Hossam, what are your final thoughts or your just one key takeaway?
Few takeaways. Any bank or financial institution must clearly specify what is the strategy and must consider the pillars of any strategy, which contains the customer, the mobile app, the backend at the bank side, and also the connectivity between the two components. This is one. The second one, that banks must implement aggressive alerting system to the customer using emails, SMS, and any other way of communication in case of any suspicious transactions to keep the customer in the safe side. Also, I think, and I'm expecting that banks and financial institutions will focus more in the multi-factor authentication and biometric technologies, especially with the revolution of the open banking and the digital banking came in the way. Also, I think the customer must help the banks and the financial institution to secure him using a wise authentication way and how to communicate with any third party. Uh, Last, that banks must have a holistic monitoring system to monitor all the channels communicated with the customer, not only the mobile banking, but also the ATM, the electronic checks, the branches, and so on, because sometimes the fraudster take the action from one channel and complete it from other channels. So holistic monitoring is very important in the future.
Okay, brilliant. James, definitely 30 seconds. 15.
Yeah, I think all I say is I think the fact that we've touched on so many different areas, analytics, data science, information security, operations, and so on, just goes to show how wide-ranging the problem is and how holistic the approach needs to be. So yeah, I totally agree with Sam. I think a holistic approach is the only way to deal with this kind of threat.
Okay, brilliant. And Greg, you've got 10 seconds. Wrap it
Yeah,
up for
I
us.
fully mirror what Hassam and James said there. A holistic view, understand your data, improve your data quality, and also consider the attack on the process, not necessarily just the technology. And
Okay,
shield the
brilliant. So thank you all. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, James. Thank you, Hossam. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you to OneSpan for making it possible. And thank you to the audience for watching all the way to the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good
Thank
day.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.